Hello everyone, I'm Lebedinsky. I'm a security engineer at Security Innovation, and today I'm going to do 4 things. I'm going to start by telling you guys a story. Then we're going to analyze the NSA real quick. After we're done analyzing the NSA, we're going to become the NSA. And finally, I'm going to have a call to action. So let's get right into it. First, a story. The year is 2013. The Edward Snowden leaks have just published millions of internal government files from the NSA, as well as many other intelligence agencies, both in the US and abroad. These disclosures have shocked the world, revealing for the first time the real extent of the modern age of digital surveillance. However, among these documents, while many of them make a major splash in the public consciousness, quite a few of them fall through, right? Obviously, there's millions of documents. The public is not going to pay attention to every single one of them. And one of these that kind of slips through the cracks a little bit is this right here. There was an internal CSEC, which is the Canadian NSA basically, presentation where it was revealed that they were using MAC addresses, which they were obtaining through airports' Wi-Fi connections, in order to track Canadian travelers, and they were doing this as part of a trial run for the NSA. I'm going to be attributing a lot of this to the NSA throughout this talk, just because it's punchier. This was a CSEC and NSA joint effort, so kind of keep that in mind going forward. This internal slide deck has some pretty concerning stuff. This is a slide from that. It's labeled top secret. Don't worry about that. So you can see that across they said they swept a modest-sized city, and in just 2 high-traffic locations, over 2 weeks, they were able to surveil 300,000 unique devices. That is terrifying, right? That is a test pilot for their program. And this doesn't, like I said, doesn't make much of a splash in the public consciousness, but it kind of makes a couple of waves in security circles. There's a few blog posts about it, a couple of articles. And eventually people realize, yeah, this is a very legitimate privacy concern. And so Apple initially develops a defense measure called MAC randomization. They deploy it in iOS 8 in 2014, so like a year or half a year after these disclosures. Microsoft and Google follow suit in 2015 with Windows 10 and Android 6, and this fixed everything. We all lived happily ever after. Great end of the story. Well, I mean, okay, I would like for this to be the case, but I mean, I guess I can end the presentation here. I have another 22 minutes or something. We might as well look at what the NSA was actually doing, right? So let's analyze the NSA. Let's suppose that we are the NSA and we want to track a random civilian, right? For good reasons, I'm sure. What does every single random civilian carry with them? Well, they carry their smartphone. Yeah, I heard that somewhere. Nice. What is every single smartphone doing at all times? Well, it's like communicating with cell towers, for example, and that is a way that the feds are surveilling people. Like they will get data from telecommunications providers and then triangulate people's positions based on the signal strength to each cell tower around them. But that requires going with a warrant somewhere and maybe even a gag order to make sure that the telecommunications company doesn't tattle on you. It's a real pain in the ass. So what if we instead look at how phones scan for Wi-Fi networks? They're just doing that passively. How does that process look like? Well, let's find out. It is specified in what is called IEEE 802.11. This is the Wi-Fi protocol specification, introduced back in the 90s. And the way it works is devices are sending out 802.11 frames whenever they are interacting with Wi-Fi. So these frames, here's an oversimplified format. So they have a source MAC address. MAC stands for Medium Access Control. It has nothing to do with Macintoshes. You have a destination MAC address and a frame type, and then some other data depending on what frame type you're sending. Let's look at MAC addresses specifically, because we have both source and destination MAC addresses. These are 6-byte addresses which are assigned to a network interface controller, or an NIC. They are usually set in the firmware for the NIC. NIC is just like the Wi-Fi card in your device, or if you're using this for Ethernet or Bluetooth or whatever, it's whatever chip is interacting with the network. It's usually set in the firmware by the manufacturer. And like I said, it's used for Ethernet, Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, a bunch of other stuff in the general IEEE 802 family of technologies. And it is used to distinguish devices which are in the same physical area. So unlike an IP address where you're going to be using that for on a global level, to communicate across the entire internet, MAC addresses are for communicating with other devices which are basically in the same room with you or close to that. The operating system can usually change the MAC address. Here we have some examples on the right. This is just some that I sniffed in Wireshark. You can see that there are 6 octets separated by these colons for readability. Let's take a look at 802.11 frames. Here are some common frame types. There are probe requests. This is how you actually scan for Wi-Fi. When your device wants to know what Wi-Fi networks are nearby, it sends out a probe request saying, hey, I'm device X. Every access point, so like Wi-Fi router or whatever, in the area, please announce your presence. And then all Wi-Fi networks around you will send a probe response saying, hey, I'm the access point with MAC address X, name XYZ, feel free to connect to me. And then if your device wants to connect, it will send an association request saying, hey, I'd like to connect to this specific access point. Obviously, there are many other frame types. These are the ones which are going to be relevant for what we're doing today. Here's the crux of the problem that the NSA is going to exploit. Every single time a device scans for Wi-Fi networks, it has to broadcast its MAC address in the clear. This is by design, right? In order to be able to interact with IEEE 802.11, you need to send out your MAC address and you just say, hi, hey, I'm identifying myself as this device. In the same way that if you want to send any internet traffic anywhere, they're going to see your IP address. So let's do surveillance, NSA style. Here is step 1. We are going to set up a bunch of probe request sniffers across an area. So here we have these little doggos, or they represent our sniffers. The sniffers are just going to be like little chips that are just listening on 2.4 gigahertz and 5 gigahertz, so like the frequencies for Wi-Fi. And they're going to be paying attention to all of the probe requests which are being sent in a specific area. So like in literally like a radius of, I don't know, 100, 150 feet. So you put one in Cap Hill, you put one in International District, you put one near the Space Needle, et cetera, one in the UW area. And then you compile this giant database of when each MAC address was seen at which location. So here we see, for example, that MAC address I've highlighted in blue. It was seen at Cap Hill at 7 o'clock, and then at U District at 7:45. So whoever owns that device moved from Cap Hill to U District in that time. And congratulations, you can now just passively track millions of devices. You don't need any warrants, you don't need any gag orders, you don't need any 0 days. You're good. Because this is the crux of the talk, I would like to reiterate what the attack is here. So basically, the NSA is putting a bunch of devices across, just scattering them across a city, having them log all MAC addresses that they see in their vicinity. And then after that, because those MAC addresses are unique and persistent identifiers, every time one of those sniffers picks up one of those MAC addresses, they know that whoever owns that device is in that area right now. So how do we fix this? Well, let's formulate the problem. Like I said, the problem is that our devices are constantly broadcasting a static, unique identifier everywhere. And to fix this, we have to make our MAC address no longer static. It has to be unique just because otherwise it wouldn't work as an address, but we can make it no longer static. And that is what MAC randomization is. It's the process of just periodically changing your MAC address to just something completely random. Here's a typical implementation, as you might see in a modern operating system. We are going to use a random address on every probe request, every time we send out a probe request. We are also going to use a random address every time we connect to a network. This takes 2 forms in practice. Usually, devices will randomize the first time they are connecting to a network. And then after that, they will use that same randomized MAC address going forward every time they connect to that specific network. I'll talk about a bit later about why that is. Sometimes the device will actually re-randomize a new MAC address every single time it connects to a network, but that can be annoying for usability. It is better for privacy, but it is not the default because it causes usability problems. Here are some common failures with MAC randomization, which can allow surveillance to be conducted anyways. Sometimes probe requests just aren't randomized, and at that point, well, you're not really doing anything. Sometimes association requests, like when you're trying to connect to a network, will not be randomized. You might have cryptographically insecure randomization. This one is thankfully quite uncommon. I have not seen it in a while because it should not be difficult to generate a random number. Sometimes the device will just randomly default to a hardware address like as a treat for no reason. And you might have timing attacks and fingerprinting attacks, which we will talk about later in more detail. Here are some specific failure examples, which all of these are from a paper written by Fensk and others in 2021. It was published in the PET Symposium. This is a very seminal work. Like a lot of this talk would not have been possible without this paper, so huge shout out to them. There are sometimes different failures among devices, even when they are using the same operating system. So for example, Motorola devices, which obviously use Android, have different failures than other Android devices, where they will leak hardware addresses when they are active, so when they're actively using a Wi-Fi network. But when they're passive, they will like randomize everything totally normally. Some older Apple devices don't randomize what are called sequence numbers in 802.11, which allows for like kind of better like fingerprinting. It's a little bit of metadata that you can use to de-anonymize like a randomized address. And yeah, fingerprinting. What I mean by fingerprinting is using other metadata in an 802.11 frame in order to like construct a unique identity for a device based on other stuff, like for example, what the length of the frame that it's sending is, like how long it takes to send that, what the radio capabilities of the device are, what radio channel it's using. You can use all that to try to construct like a partially unique like set of identifiers for a device, even if it's randomizing its MAC address completely correctly. So I specifically have been looking at macronization on Windows because it is a heavily under-researched area. Almost all research on macronization is about mobile devices, which makes sense because it is considered to be a higher impact scenario for phones, right? Like everyone is carrying their phone around with them everywhere. Not everyone is carrying a Windows device everywhere. But I think that it is still relevant because there are laptops, obviously, which many people in this room, I'm sure, are every day carrying a laptop. There are Windows-based handhelds increasingly, like there's an ROG Ally kind of like gaming handheld thing which uses Windows. These are becoming increasingly popular. There's a rumored future Xbox handheld, which whatever, I won't say too much about, I guess because we're in Microsoft. Which will probably be Windows-based. Don't kill me, Microsoft people. So if we actually look at how the randomization works on Windows, there is very little documentation. In fact, almost all of the stuff I got from a presentation that someone who just worked on the feature gave in 2015. And if not for this if not for the slides for this presentation being archived online, it would have been a total pain to figure anything out about this subject. Here are the important details. Randomization is off by default. Great, thanks. Probe requests, however, are randomized, so okay, thank you. Don't kick me out of the Microsoft yet. And randomization is cryptographically secure, so they take a SHA-256 hash of a client secret, which is stored on the machine, the SSID of the network if you're connected to it, and a connection ID, and then they truncate that whole thing. So it's whatever, it's functionally random. You're not gonna be cracking this. The client secret is stored in the registry somewhere. But now that we know how the implementation works, let's see how we can break it. Let's become the NSA. This is also known as a findings section for normal people. First of all, hotspots do not have their MAC address randomized. When you turn on a hotspot on a Windows device, the MAC address of that hotspot is just your hardware MAC address, but with the locally administered bit flipped to a 1. Locally administered is like a bit in the MAC address which specifies whether your MAC address has been changed by the operating system or not. And so they just flip that bit and call it a day. This is maybe not a bug. The severity of this is very low overall because like if the feds want to track you and you're walking around with a hotspot all the time, they can just track the name of your hotspot. It's whatever. This is relatively low impact. This is, however, a higher impact. All probe requests will use the same randomized MAC address up until you reset the NIC. So that happens if you reboot your computer, if you toggle your Wi-Fi on and off, other stuff like that. Or if you connect to or disconnect from a network. So if a target is walking around just like from point A to point B and they don't connect to any Wi-Fi networks along the way, which is a pretty reasonable like scenario in day-to-day life, it is trivial to track them. They are going to be sending out probe requests with the exact same MAC address throughout their entire journey. Moreover, what if they do connect to a Wi-Fi network? Like what if they pass by a Starbucks and they auto-connect to the Starbucks, they leave the range, and then they disconnect from the Starbucks? Well, let's take a look at what our sniffers will see. At some point, address X is sending probe requests, and then suddenly just stops. It stops sending any traffic whatsoever. Then immediately at that point, address Y connects to some network. Then at some point later, address Y disconnects, and then immediately address Z starts sending probe requests. Well, the attacker can be pretty confident that X, Y, and Z are all belonging to the same or are all the same device. So tracking is still viable in this scenario. Let's talk about timing and fingerprinting. Probe requests on Windows are sent almost exactly every 60 seconds. It's like 60.0015 or something like that. And so if you have a persistent view of the target, so you have sniffers which like at any point in time along the person's journey, you always have a sniffer which is picking up their probe requests, you can correlate their MAC addresses. This is finicky. It requires obviously a very high density of sniffers. That's not really a problem if you're the NSA. It's a problem if you're a researcher like me. But it's made more viable if you like fingerprint based off of hardware capabilities and other stuff like that. So here's like a Wireshark screenshot showing like stuff that you could fingerprint based off of, so like hardware capabilities and other stuff like that. But all of this is made kind of moot by an undocumented quote-unquote feature. I use the term feature derogatorily here because I think that it should be considered a bug. As far as I can tell, it is intentional. When you turn on randomization system-wide on Windows, it remains off for any known networks. Any network that you were already connected to before this point, randomization will not be turned on for unless you turn it on manually. And this behavior is never made apparent to the end user. There is no easy one-click fix. You literally have to go into every single one of those networks, click on the network in settings, turn on randomization, click on the other network, turn on randomization, do that. And this is especially bad because like, on Windows 11 at least, you have to connect to a Wi-Fi network in order to set up your device. You physically cannot turn on MAC randomization before connecting to a Wi-Fi network on Windows 11 without like doing a, whatever, the command line bypass, but nobody's doing that, with the exception of people here. So this allows us to do essentially a variant of an evil twin attack, where if a device is leaking its hardware MAC address, right? So if MAC randomization is turned off for all of those networks, the device will leak its hardware MAC address every time it tries to connect to one of those specific networks. We can just pretend to be one of those networks. We can send a spoofed probe response with like guesses at common SSIDs. So like we say, hey, I'm Starbucks Wi-Fi, I'm CenturyLink bunch of numbers, I'm Xfinity Wi-Fi, I'm University of Washington Wi-Fi if we want to surveil activists on college campuses or whatever. And then if a user has connected to any of these networks before they turned on randomization, bam, their device automatically just tries to connect and leaks its hardware address. Notably, the device doesn't even have to successfully connect to your network, it just has to start trying to connect to it. As soon as it starts trying, as soon as it sends that association request, it is sending its hardware MAC address. And it is trivial to detect when you've successfully gotten someone to leak their hardware address because you just look at the locally administered bit. We can extend this to other operating systems. So Android, Windows, and iOS implementations of MAC randomization actually all by default have the behavior of reusing one MAC address for a network every single time you connect to it after you initially connect to it. So it will randomize once and then reuse that forever. This is so that you don't have problems with like captive gateways. So like if you go to a hotel and you connect to the Wi-Fi and you like pay for one device, you don't want to have the hotel thinking that you're connecting a new device every time you reconnect. This is called persistent randomization. And our evil twin attack will always get the device to leak the same address, even with MAC randomization implemented and turned on as intended. So when we set up our evil twin, if a device has connected to that network in the past before, every single time it will send an association request with the same MAC address. It will be a quote-unquote randomized address, but it will be static. It will be unchanging. Every single time we do this, the device will send the exact same address. So the attack complexity doesn't actually meaningfully increase from the NSA's perspective from MAC randomization as it currently exists on all operating systems. Sniffers just need to passively send out like fake Starbucks Wi-Fi probe requests. And with this knowledge, we can finally become the NSA. So we set up a bunch of Wi-Fi sniffers across a large area. We have those sniffers pretend to be some common network name like Starbucks Wi-Fi. We note down which MAC addresses attempt to connect to that network, and then when a specific device is near any of our sniffers, it will always attempt to connect with the same unique identifier. And then we just do surveillance the exact same way as we were doing previously. So this is an NSA-grade attack, so it clearly requires some NSA-graded hardware. We are going to use 1,000 ESP32s. And that's it. That's kind of just all you need. You can buy these things for $1, and you can cover an entire city center with like 1,000 of these pretty easily. This is a very low-cost attack. It is viable for me to do. It is viable for any of you to do. Please do not use this for stalking. It would be very bad. This is solved by something called non-persistent randomization, as opposed to persistent. Where iOS and Windows both have the option to randomize addresses every 24 hours. Android has a developer option to re-randomize on each connection to a specific network. But the average user is very unlikely to ever turn these on because these options are nested layers deep in the network settings. Nobody knows what they do. On iOS and Windows, you have to change them individually per network. And so like these security features don't do anything if nobody is going to turn them on. That is kind of the takeaway from this talk is, where does this leave us? Across all three major operating systems, MAC address tracking is still very viable. So this technique that was revealed in leaks that the CSEC and NSA were already test piloting in 2012, it is 2025 now, it is still viable to do. So that brings us to the call to action. We need more eyes on this problem. MAC address tracking is heavily under-researched. It is researched almost exclusively in academic circles, and then probably like a couple of people at like Google and Apple and Microsoft like internally researching it. This talk I've given has barely scratched the surface. Here are some further areas. Feel free to poke at these if you are interested. Bluetooth. Bluetooth uses MAC addresses. Everything uses Bluetooth. Your car has Bluetooth. Does your car randomize its Bluetooth MAC addresses? Probably not. Is that bad? Probably. AirTags, they also use Bluetooth. There's an interesting kind of conundrum there where if you randomize those addresses too often, it makes it too easy to use AirTags for stalking. So they have like a whole system for how often they randomize. And then we need to develop better defensive measures because the current ones are insufficient. This is more critical now than ever. Domestic surveillance is especially harmful under oppressive regimes. And hoo boy, it's not looking good out there. There is already precedent for surveillance of student activists, so that's why I mentioned University of Washington Wi-Fi, people seeking abortions, etc. Things will get worse in the coming years, and so this isn't just a cool technical problem that I get to yap about. It is something which directly affects at-risk individuals. So with that said, acknowledgements. Special thanks to the authors of the paper I mentioned earlier. It is a really good paper. I highly recommend reading it. Security Innovation, my employer, for facilitating this research. Matthias Fontanini, who created this cool command line presentation tool that I've been using. And Batman's Kitchen for enduring me yapping about MAC addresses for 2 years. Thank you, guys. You can find me on various locations. If you're cool on Signal, the other two I don't really check that often, but feel free to reach out.